So it has worked for me personally, so I'd vouch for it.
That enabling environment, as I said, those could really push a true and serious candidate and aspirant towards that edging forward.
जो फोकस होना चाहिए बच्चों के प्रति, लाइक ए पेरेंट्स, दे आर गाइडिंग अस.
Hello everyone, welcome to the ForumIAS Townhall, that is Daily Newspaper Analysis. Today, December 4, 2025, we are going to discuss these 5 following articles. So the first article is about a missing link in India's mineral mission. So this first article is basically talking about that there are various sectors like clean energy, defense and electronics. For them, we need critical mineral supplies. And India is aiming in this direction to secure those critical mineral supplies. But the issue is that though we are working in this direction, we are not focusing on processing and the refining of those minerals, and which is making us that we are more dependent on the imports of these minerals like lithium, cobalt and nickel. And we know that if we are importing it, so at the one hand, we are exposing ourselves to the vulnerabilities which can be created due to the disruption in our global supply chain. So this article, the authors talks about various policy recommendations in this direction, that what we can do that to improve our critical mineral supply, as well as we can have a better processing of our mineral resources. Second news article is about a dismantling of the base of environmental regulation. So recently the Supreme Court has revoked its May 2025 judgment, and in recent judgment the Supreme Court has allowed the post facto approval of the environmental clearances. For the, if you are aware that we have EIA, Environmental Impact Assessment Act. In this there is a provision that for certain categories of the project there should be prior approval of the environmental clearances. But recently, the Supreme Court has allowed that yes, you can take the post projects also. So because of this judgment, many sections of our societies, especially from the environmental list people, they have criticized this judgment, and they find that with this, they are going to weakening the environmental governance in our country. The third and fourth article is related to the cyclone data, which has recently hit the Sri Lanka and the Indian states like Tamil Nadu. And because of this cyclone, there was a disaster. But the issue is that it is highlighting the issues in our government, urban governance. Because of that, a disaster, a normal extreme climate phenomena has become a disaster for our cities. So it basically talking about the loopholes in our urban governance and how we can rectify those things. The fifth article is taking the leap. It is basically talking about the leprosies. So recently the Supreme Court has taken the suo motu cognizance that there are continuing discrimination against the person within a leprosy. And this discrimination is not just limited to the societal level as well as at the legal level. The NHRC, National Human Rights Commission, has identified 97 central and state laws that discriminates the person with a leprosy. So in this direction, what should be our steps and what should be the broader policy implication of these things, so that we are going to discuss today. So let's start with our first news article, that is a missing link in India's mineral mission. So as we know that India has an aspiration to become 5 trillion economy and the world largest economy. For these targets to achieve, we need the secure critical mineral supplies. And in this direction, various laws like Mines and Minerals Development and Regulation Act has been implemented, which has up to the certain level improved our mining capacity. But we have ignored, or these laws has ignored, the processing and the refining of those minerals. And because of this, what is happening that we are becoming dependent on the imports of the critical minerals like lithium, cobalt, nickels. And as we know that as we are dependent on the imports, we are exposing ourselves, are exposing our supply chains to the global disruptions. So if there is any global disruption, it is going to create the supply chain impact on our imports. So that is an issue which has been highlighted by this news article, and it has suggested that we have to focus more on the processing and the refining of our minerals. So first thing, why the processing matters? The processing matters because the processing converts the raw ores into a usable materials like EV batteries, semiconductors, solar panels, and the defense technology. And without domestic refining, India's supply chain remains vulnerable to the global shocks, like China's temporary restrictions in October 2025. And the China's restriction was on the exports of the rare earth magnets and the graphite anodes. So obviously, if China is restricting the export, it is going to impact the supply chain, and it is going to impact the India's also. So we are exposing and increasing our vulnerability in this direction. Another one is, if we see the case of China, China currently refines over 90% of the rare earth and 70 to 80% of lithium and cobalt compounds. And if we see the current Indian scenario, India has Indian mines, and we partially process 7 critical minerals. That is copper, graphite, silicon, tin, titanium, rare earth, zirconium. And if we talked about the purity levels and the scale, it remained very inadequate because the domestic graphite purity is around 92%, 92 to 99%. But the battery industries, there is a demand of 99.95%. So though we are processing certain critical minerals, the purity level is also below the inadequate and below the requirement. And if we talked about the domestic tin output, it meets just 1% of the national demands. So this is showing that how we are lagging behind on the step of processing those minerals. If we see the government initiatives, there is a national critical mineral missions, and the government has set up 9 centers of excellence to promote R&D and apply the innovation. The government has also come up with a scheme, that is critical mineral recycling scheme in 2025. Aim of this scheme was to recover the minerals from the waste, like fly ash, red mud, slags. Because if you have seen that the fly ash, red mud also contains certain rare earth metals. And if we have a technologies, so with that help of technologies, we can recover those minerals, and it will be like recovering, because the fly ash, red muds, all are the waste. So even from the waste, we can recover the rare earth metals, critical minerals, but we don't have those technologies, and because of that, we are not able to recover it. Another one is, there is a proposal for the critical mineral processing parks, which will integrate the recovery, processing, and innovation. So, way forward, which has been suggested by this article, is that there should be 5 policy steps. So the first step, it has been recommended that innovation and R&D. So the author is recommending that we should make Center of Excellence and NCCM engines of applied research for the high purity materials. And there should be a focus on developing the technologies readiness and industrial collaboration, so that those technologies can be used at the commercial level. And in this, we can collaborate with the extreme institutes like IIT, CSR, and there should be also collaboration with the industries also, so that the technologies should be as per the industrial demand. The next step which has been recommended is about recycling and secondary sources. So as we know that from the secondary sources, from the waste also, we can recover it, and still we don't have those technologies to recover it, because so we are not able to do that. So it is recommended that we should utilize the waste streams like fly ash. It contains rare earth. Red mud has gallium. Zinc residues has cobalt. And it should be backed by the environmental clearances reforms and PSU participation also. Another recommendation is about the skill development. So it talks about that we should create new training modules for the hydrometallurgy, advanced refining through IITs, NITs, and industry-linked apprenticeship like Hindustan Coppers, Vedanta Hindalco. Another one is about financing and demand assurance. So it is talking about that investment in the mineral exploration or processing and refining is a very high risk one and heavy cost capital intensive. And if the investors does not have a confidence, there will be risk of investment. So if the government, just like it has an MSP policies for the agriculture product, where the government assure that whatever you produce, we will going to at least, if you are not able to sell out in the market rate, we are here, we can procure it. So if a government comes up with a similar provisions in this sector, so that will create a demand assurance and help in their financing position. So that will also encourage the private sectors in this sector, in this direction. So de-risk the investment by guaranteeing the offtake and creating a critical mineral market mechanism under the Ministry of Mines and ensuring the domestic sourcing obligation for the strategic sector. So as you are aware that the government can make certain procurement obligations from those like PSUs and all those institutions. There we can say that if you have to procure those minerals from the domestic suppliers only. So these types of provisions can also be made. Another one is about the mineral diplomacy. What it is trying to say that we usually collaborate with the foreign countries, and mostly that is more related to the exploration of mines. Now we have to move out. Now we have to move one step further. We should collaborate with the foreign countries, but now we should become partners in their processing and refining of those minerals also. It's not just limited to the exploration of minerals. So we have to link the overseas mineral acquisition with the processing capacities, partnership like Australia, Canada, India Technology and Innovation Partnership, and integrate such cooperation in forums like G20, BRICS and IPEF. So let's move to our next news article, that is about dismantling of the base of environmental regulation. So what is the background of this? So we have EIA, Environmental Impact Assessment 2006. So what does it talks about? It talks about that certain categories of projects needs environmental approval, prior environmental approval before starting the projects. Idea is so that we can protect our environment from the harms or the impact of that projects. But what happened in 2017, government come up with a notification. The notification was one time 6-month window was given to those projects who has commenced the work on site and they didn't take the prior approval. So the government gave them relaxation and allowed them that even if you have started your work without the environmental clearances, now you can apply within 6 months and you can get the environmental clearances even after the starting of your projects. But what happened in 2021? In 2021, the government comes up with an office memorandum, come up with a standard operating procedure. And here in 2017, it was a one-time affair. A 6-month window was given. But in 2021, through the office order, what it did, it regularized this process. So now what they are doing is they are allowing the projects to take the post starting of your projects. You can take afterward the starting of a project, you can take the environmental clearances. There is no need for the prior approval of environmental clearances. So you can take it afterward, and with this, you can just pay the penalties or few fines. So indirectly, what we are seeing that government is allowing the projects to violate the laws. So this case was taken up to the Supreme Court. So in Supreme Court, in Common Cause case versus versus Union of India, MC Mehta case, One Shakti case, in all those cases, most of the judgment was that if there is retrospective provision and clearances provisions, so it is going to undermine the environmental impact assessment, and that will be detrimental to the environment. So that was the stand of the Supreme Court earlier. But recently, the Supreme Court recalled its in the review judgment. It changed it and it granted in certain exceptional cases that yes, if you haven't taken the prior approval, you can take up the approval afterward. And the idea, the statement or the argument was that if we stop the operation or if we demolished any completed projects, it is going to cause the economic cost as well as it is going to create more pollution. So that's why we are allowing those projects to continue and they can take up the environmental clearances later on. So this was an issue which was raised, but it has obviously an implication because it is going to weakening the environmental clearances provisions. So this is what the whole article is. So the background talks about EIA and ex post facto environmental clearances. So this talks about that EIA notification 2006, certain categories of project like industry, mining, infrastructure need prior environmental clearances before starting the projects or expanding the capacity, which was usually the studies, public hearing, expert appraisal, conditions and all those things. But in 2017 notification, the one-time 6-month windows was given to apply for the environmental clearance, even if the project has already started without environmental clearances. But in 2021, the office memorandum created a standing mechanism to regularize the violation cases by allowing the ex post facto environmental clearances with penalties instead of treating 2017 as a truly one-time provision. Now, what is the implication for the environmental governance? It is going to weaken the prior environmental clearances regime because the provision like public hearing, expert appraisals, scientific evaluation, risk, all those becomes a post hoc formalities only. Because all those things, I mean, if the project has started, then what is how weightage it is going to create if there is a public hearing afterwards. So it's just like in a formalities, and it will be like once the project is already built or running or creating a FATE compliance. So it is we can say a less effective one. Another one, it will make the compliance as an optional. For example, as there is a provision of the post facto, so the developers must be tempted to start the work without environmental clearances and later seek their regularization by paying the fine or shifting the environmental risk or social cost onto the communities and future generation. So what they are trying to say is, if you are making it optional, so there is high chances that developers will start without the environmental clearance and later on they say, okay, let's pay the fines if there is anything. So that is again going to shift the environmental risk and social cost on the future generation or the communities. Another one is about the tension which is going to be created around the environmental jurisprudence. Because on one hand, the Supreme Court has expanded the ambit of the Article 21 with various judgments, and they have included various ideas and concepts like precautionary principles, intergenerational equities, right to healthy environment, all those things under Article 21. So on one hand, the Supreme Court is advocating that right to healthy environment is a fundamental rights under Article 21. And on other hand, it is creating a pragmatic line prioritizing the economic and infrastructural consideration. So from this review of their previous judgments, so it is creating a contradictions and a tension between the environmental jurisprudence. So that is also an issue which has been highlighted. Now, let's move to the next news article. So the next news article is related to the cyclone Dita, which has hit the Sri Lanka and the Chennai. So if we talked about the cyclone Dita, it shows we can use it as a case study that how can an extreme weather event can turn into a disaster because of the systematic gaps in our urban planning, drainage, and transparent governance. So in this case, we can use this article as a case study for our main answer also. So if we see a context, so what happened in Sri Lanka and Chennai is that the cyclone Dita, it moved slowly over Sri Lanka in late November 2025, dumping the intense rain bands over the same areas for the days and leading to the floods and landslides. And after crossing the Sri Lanka, the weekend system re-entered the Bay of Bengal and re-intensified briefly and then parked a deep depression of the Chennai, bringing around 18 centimeter rain in 24 hours. Even higher local totals in some stations like Ennore and Paris. So basically, it is showing that cyclone or all those things can be an environmental phenomena. But it has been created in the disaster because of the weak governance. If we see about the urban flood management, what should be the ideal practice and what we see in the Chennai case? So, if we talked about the risk knowledge, ideal practice or the recommended one under NDMC rules also, there should be the flood maps, plan and zonings, and accordingly we have to design our urban planning also. But in case, or in we can say in the practicals, these maps does not exist, or even they exist, they are not used well. Another one is about the land use zones. So there are the provisions for the no build zones on the floodplains. So in floodplains, there should not be any buildings or any type of construction should be allowed. But in case of Chennai, or we can say in the practical scenario, we see there is an encroachment over the floodplains. So which is again increasing their vulnerabilities to the urban floods. Another one is about the drainage design. So if we talked about the drainage design, the basin plans should be with extreme rain. So our drainage system should be in such design that if there is an extreme rain, we can absorb it. But that is not the case on the practical field. If we talked about the solution, the nature-based solutions, we need wetlands, ponds, and they act as a buffer in case of the urban floods. But we know that there is shrinkage of the wetlands, and there is a few green zones only, which is a good observer of the flood water. So on the practicalities, that is not available. Similarly, we talked about the institutional coordination level. So ideal practice should be there should be one clear lead agencies which ensure the coordination. But on practical or in Chennai case, we can see there are many agencies and all those agencies working in their silos. So in the disaster type situation, there need of a coordination, but that is not the case. And because of those systematic gaps, this a normal environmental phenomena becomes disaster. So that's all the article is talking about. The next article, the climate is breaching the wall of urban metrics. It is again taken up the example of the cyclone Theta. Now, what it is trying to say is that here it is criticizing the the definition of the developed cities or various metrics or various indexes we are using it to evaluate our cities. Because we, at the one hand, we are highlighting that there is an inadequacy of the current urban metrics in assessing the positive resilience of the cities to the climate changes. For example, we have indices like UN Habitat Prosperity Index, Global Livability Index. What they all do, they are doing is they are measuring or ranking the cities or on the basis of productivity and infrastructure. How that city is productive, what is the type of infrastructure is of that city, and based on that they are ranking the cities. But they are overlooking certain critical aspects like drainage systems, slope stabilities, and because of this oversight, lack of oversights leads to misallocation of the resources and prioritizing the projects. So that is the whole idea, is that our measuring our metrics or our indexes are not truly reflections of a sustainable resilient cities. And because of that, we are seeing the issues, the disaster like urban floods. So the core problem which has been identified is that there is an exclusion bias in all those indexes. For example, the global indices focus on the capital or the global cities like Mumbai and Delhi and ignores the secondary or peri-urban settlements which observe most urban growth and climate risk. So those secondary or peri-urban settlements are not being considered in their measuring indexes. Another one is about the measurement flaws. It talked about that there is a current indices assess the presence of hospitals, metros. So based on that, we are assessing whether the city is developed or not. But they are not focusing or ignoring the capacity of system to withstand the 21st century cloudburst or the floods. Another one is about take up an example, durable housing. So durable housing metrics ignores whether the homes are on unstable slopes or the floodplains. So if the house is on the floodplains or on unstable slopes, do you think that house we will consider is a safe living areas? So just there is a flaws in our measurement that if there is a house, we see that okay, this area is developed, but in reality it is not. Another one is about the misplaced modernity. So the public investment prioritizes symbolic infrastructure like airports, metro lines, and over risk reduction measures like drainage, slope controls, and enforcement. So you can see that if there is a metros or airports in any cities, so that city is considered more developed. So obviously the government is more inclined on these directions to build up those infrastructure instead of which is required, like drainage system, slope control, enforcements. All those things the government is going to ignore because we have misplaced definition of modernity. Another one is it talked about the equity gap. What it is trying to say that we have an inequality in our cities also. We have richer peoples as well as we have poor peoples. And it is talking about that intra-urban inequalities where the poor population lives. They are more vulnerable to those disasters. So the poorer population in informal and peri-urban zone face disproportionate risk because the wealthier groups or the richer peoples, they have an access to the insurance and mobility. So they can take up. So whatever the loss they are going to incur due to the disaster, that is going to be recovered. But that is not the case of the poorer population. So the wealthier groups can use the insurance and mobility while settlers face life-threatening exposures. So that is also a dimension which has been identified in this article. What is the broader implication for the urban policies? We need to integrate the climate risk metrics into our urban prosperity and livability frameworks. As well as our planning should be resilient and must include the drainage audits, hazard zonings, and relocation safeguards also. The next one is about there should be that we need to call for the data disaggregation at ward and local levels so that we can get a real equity and the safety measures. Another implication is about the global adaptation funds, and it should not be just limited to the cities or the advanced bureaucracy or reporting capacities. So the global adaptation fund should be available to the every centers, every cities, wherever there is a high risk possibilities. Let's move to our next news article, that is about taking the leap. So this news article is basically talking about the people affected with the leprosy. So what happened recently is that Supreme Court has taken a suo motu cognizance about the continuing discrimination against the person with leprosy. And it has directed the states and union territories to report the steps which has been taken to remove such biasness from legal and social level. And if we talked about NHRC, the National Human Rights Commission, it has reported about 97 central and state laws still has a provisions that discriminate against the people affected by the leprosy. So if we see the key issue which has been identified, that about the discriminatory laws denies the basic rights. For example, the use of public transports and the public spaces, eligibility for the elections or public offices, employment and business opportunities. So the people affected with the leprosy, they are being denied these things. Another one is about the use of certain derogatory terminologies in our legal text. So because of those derogatory terminologies in our legal text, it is creating the stigmas or it is strengthening the stigma against those peoples. What has been the recommendations of NHRC? So NHRC has made a certain recommendation. It talked about that first of all, we have to do the early detection and timely treatment through government programs like National Leprosy Eradication Programs. Another one, our focus should be on rehabilitating and social reintegration to uphold the dignities of those peoples affected with the leprosy. And if required, we should enact a new legislation to remove the stigmas and replace those outdated languages, which is derogatory against the peoples with the leprosy. And it has administrative level, it has find out that if you see in the Aadhaar enrollment, there is a fingerprints records also. So it has talked about that there should be iris scan for the Aadhaar enrollment, as the nerve damages in the fingerprints, making fingerprinting difficult. So these are the various recommendations the NHRC made. Let's see the Supreme Court's directive in this direction. The Supreme Court has urged center, state and UTs to take the urgent legislative actions to repeal the outdated provisions. It has emphasized the human dignity, equality, Article 14, and right to health, Article 21, for person affected by the leprosy. There is also an ethical and the governance dimensions also, which we can use in our paper 4 also. So basically, it's reflect the values of compassion, dignity, inclusion, and respect for the human rights, that we are not discriminating with even the person with affected with the leprosy. It's also demonstrate the role of judiciary as a guardian of social justice, because the judiciary has taken the suo motu cognizance of these issues. If we see the other dimension about the ethical, is that it evokes the empathy-based policies where governance meets the ethics. So if the government is coming up with those updated new provisions or various schemes, it is showing that we are reflecting our empathy towards those people. Let's see a little bit prelims factual things about the leprosy, the medical and social background. So the leprosy is caused by the Mycobacterium leprae, and leprosy is the non-infectious, and it is fully curable with a proper treatment like multi-drug therapy. If we talked about India, India still accounts 57% of global cases, mostly due to the poverty, poor sanitation, and stigma-driven delays in the treatment. And stigma has an historical roots also, because if you have seen, even in the modern history, the social reformers, even Mahatma Gandhi also worked for the people with leprosy, affected with the leprosy. So it has historical roots like fears, we have misinformation, religious myths also, and which isolate these peoples. So that's all for the daily newspaper analysis. Thank you everyone for joining us.